You're welcome back. It's still the Policy Council. My guest has been Okey Enalamah, and like you may have heard, he has an excellent, interesting, exciting life story. Started life as a medical doctor, indeed spent 8 years of his life training and qualifying as a medical doctor. Became a chartered accountant and went through the rigor of acquiring a second profession because he found that he knew what he wanted to do. And then he got into this interesting thing called private equity in South Africa and later in Nigeria. And he's built, along with his partners and mentors, I would say, a strong firm called African Capital Alliance. We continue the discussion with Okey into how private equity integrates within the Nigerian financial sector, linked with insurance, linked with financial markets, capital markets, indeed sovereign wealth funds and all of those elements. And then we'll talk about some of the criticism that we've read about in global circles about private equity.
My name is Laide Awoyemi. I live for Lagos. You see as our new Lagos just define the go. Good thing good though. To go market now, no hard at all. Just pay. Sit down inside BRT bus. Small time, you don't reach where they go. Hospital call, the full ground. And for me and my pikin where I just born, treatment now free. You look left, you look right. Them they build new roads, new hospitals, new schools, new things everywhere. Everywhere they shine, gone. We thank God though. But come on, I hear saying that this tax money wey they pay, and then they use do all these good things. Me I they pay my own tax too. Say they pay on your own.
Pay your tax. It's your civic responsibility. It's your duty. It's the law.
You've described this. I think anybody who has been following the conversation will have a fair understanding of what private equity is. But how does it situate? So let's say take a typical financial system. How would you situate it? How does it link with the capital market? How does it link with what we now have, the sovereign wealth fund, pensions, insurance, and all of those other elements?
Excellent question. So if you recall what I said in sort of an earlier segment, I said if you think about private equity, there are three elements that have to come together for private equity to succeed and become a sustainable asset class or part of the sort of investment landscape in any country or in any economy. One part of it is sort of the funding, the long-term funding of people who are looking for returns on funds that are meant to be put to work over the long term. And if you ask yourselves, why would such people put money in private equity? Basically, over time, private equity systematically or over time has earned more returns or superior returns to, say, investing in bonds or the stock market. And the reason is that like you have to pay something extra for the illiquidity, the fact that this company is not listed compared to, say, a listed company. And we normally demand that as part of negotiation when the money is going in. But the typical sources of that funding is sort of what you might call institutional investors of all kinds. A key group being the pension funds, because pension funds by their very nature tend to be long-term. These are people's savings during their working life so that when they retire, they'll have a nest egg, they'll have the funding to fund their lifestyle post-retirement. And that money has to be put to work to earn a return during that time when they're working. And you find that in most economies that are developed, and ours is a developing economy, private equity as an asset class will get some of that funding, typically about 10 or 15%, for instance. Okay. And so when Nigeria launches a sort of pension act, and with the accumulation of pension funds, one of the things we've seen developing, and the PENCOM has been at the heart of this, is also beginning to make allocation, cautiously, but definitely to private equity. And I would say as African Capital Alliance, being the leading private equity firm or pioneer private equity firm in the country, we've actually worked with Nigerian pension funds to see that some of their capital will come to work in private equity. Okay. Now, if you kind of look at the pension system that way, Nigerian sovereign wealth fund to some degree fit into that as well. Because again, long-term funding is institutional funding, and some of it may well and should go into private equity. And indeed, we know the folks over there, and we're having a dialogue with them as well. Now, if you think in terms of the capital market, Nigerian Stock Exchange and so on, they become interesting from what I said earlier, that private equity is really investments in private companies before they go public. Okay. So typically, the capital markets should be the gateway, where that will create the liquidity for those people, or the exit for those people who invested in the companies when they were private, so that when they go public, the wider population can invest in it, and in an orderly way, the private investors can exit if they choose to, or they can then own it like any other stock that they own. And that's what we try to orchestrate. But let me also emphasize that that's only one way to get liquidity. Okay. A lot of private businesses get bought by other businesses or merge with other businesses, what we call a strategic sale, or a trade sale, or sell to strategic buyers. That happens. You also have financial buyers. The pension funds can also buy a business when it stabilizes, and just because of the stream of dividends and income, yes.
Okay, so let me ask you, there was a season in which there was a lot of negative publicity for private equity, especially in America. People implied that it destroyed jobs, it was taking companies out, it was probably too focused on the returns to the investor rather than jobs and all of that. And some looked at issues around taxation and all of that. What would you say to those critics, especially in relation to our own market? Because we may not be as sophisticated as that US scenario that they were complaining about, but what do you say to the general criticisms around private equity?
And you make a key point about the differences between markets. So the US is a market that has become so sophisticated, or that has become so sophisticated that, like, private equity is now pushing the boundaries and expanding its role. So in the US, you see, for instance, they do what is called leverage buyout. This is where you can take a lot of debt, buy a business, and then use the cash flows from the business to repay the debt. And then obviously after you pay back the debt, the company belongs to you. And you can keep pushing the boundaries of how much debt you take to the point where you might become singularly focused on how much cash the business generates to pay back the debt, and not in terms of how the business grows. Contrast that with what is going on here. What we do here is what is called growth equity, because our economy is growing. Our economy doesn't have such mature businesses where you can just go and borrow any amount you like and be able to predict the cash flows into the future. What we have is more like businesses that require capital for growth, working capital to grow, working capital for capital expenditure, capital for capital expenditure, and so on and so forth. So that's a key distinction between private equity, the LBO model in the US, and growth capital here. It means that I would argue that there's a lot more development role we're playing here, because we're working with businesses at a very important time in their life cycle to help them to grow and develop. Let me also say that as a result, in terms of our value added, you find that, like, we're doing a lot of work on the operations of the business, in terms of people, how they hire, in terms of the board, in terms of markets, providing access to market, in terms of, for foreign companies that we work with, providing interface with the local environment and so on, which may be different from the role a private equity investor will play in a more developed market. So there are some important differences, and therefore I hope that we will be more additive to this economy than attract or get criticism.
I think you're right. From my own perspective, we're still far from the position in which private equity will get to those possibly debatable levels of activities. Let's take another time out, having this very illuminating discussion around the subject of private equity with Okey and Enalamah. We'll be right back.
My name is Femi Durojayi. Welcome to the New Lagos, where things are improving every day. I work on the island and live on the mainland. But that's no longer a problem. With improved roads, I get to work faster. Sometimes I even leave my car and use the BRT bus, which is comfortable, fast, efficient, and reliable. After a hard day's work, the nights and evenings are even more fun. The streets are better lit, and the city is more secure, so I can catch my phone in peace. I pay my taxes because I want to continue enjoying the good things a big modern city like our Lagos brings. So it's my taxes that makes them real. Have you paid your tax?
Pay your tax. It's your civic responsibility. It's your duty. It's the law.
You're welcome back. I'm talking to Mr. Dr. Okey Enalamah, the CEO of African Capital Alliance. Okay, so let's talk about ACA itself. In terms of its performance and in its impact, first of all, what sectors have you typically found that you could play in within the Nigerian economy?
Let me start from where you started, which is in terms of its impact and performance, and then link it to the sectors. I think one of the founding elements or founding aspects of ACA that is quite interesting is that we were founded by people who had achieved a measure of success in their careers. Dick Kramer had run Arthur Andersen and retired. Chief Ernest Shonekon had run UAC and retired. Pascal Dozier had built Diamond Bank successfully. Mohammed Hayatuddin had built FSB and before then NNDC and so on. And Tom Barry had run the Rockefeller Wealth and then set up his own thing successfully. And myself, I was the youngest actually. And one of the things that led our founding partners, particularly those that were based in Nigeria, including Dick and the other three, to want to start ACA was the whole idea of trying to support economic development while at the same time showing that you could do it right. That if you did it right, you could make long-term successful investments and at the same time support the economy, whatever sectors we're developing. And I say that because it has a direct bearing on our strategy. So we tend to want to be partners in those sectors of the economy which are developing in a way where the private sector can take a leadership position or a driver's seat and drive it and help the economy to reach its full potential. One of the best examples of that is telecoms. That when the telecom sector deregulated in 2001 and the digital mobile licenses were awarded, we had the good fortune of joining MTN, and as you know, one of our partners, Pascal Dozier, is the chairman. And you can see what that sector has done. It's been quite explosive in its growth. It has over 120, 150, some people say 170 million lines today. And part of that has just been by allowing the private sector to come in with the capital, come in with the management, come in with the resources that are needed so that the government is not bogged down with trying to do it. And we hope the same thing will happen with power, by the way, which is why we applaud and support government initiative to deregulate power. The same principle applies to all the other sectors, financial services, insurance
You've
sector.
made a big pitch into insurance and banking.
Exactly. So those the same principle. So when under the last CBN administration, some of the banks were recapitalized and they invited private sector investment. We basically helped to mobilize a consortium of investors, a club of investors that put in $500 million US into Union Bank and became the core investor in Union Bank. And as you can see, the bank is rebuilding as we speak. We've done the same thing in insurance with a company called Cornerstone Insurance, where again we made a modest investment in an insurance company. We recently bought the Fin Insurance that was sold by FCMB. And the idea is to also play a similar positive role in the insurance sector, which as you know is a sector that is not reached its full potential by any measure. Therefore, I think
let me ask you about one other sector, which I think you've made attempts. I'm not sure compared with those three you mentioned. The ICT sector. What's been your experience in that sector?
So when we think about telecoms, we think about telecoms, media, and technology, media, and telecommunications. So broadly speaking, we kind of put all of them in that same area. We've had a good experience in this sector in the sense that if you look at what the NCC did under sort of Ahmed Joda as the chairman and Ernest Ndukwe as engineer, Ernest Ndukwe as the DG, I think they did a lot of good work. And if you look at the number of companies that came out of that, it allowed the private sector to bring those elements I talked about: capital, know-how, people, and so on. And I think you'll find that we made a number of investments there. We've invested in Resourcery successfully and exited. We've invested in GS Telecom that used to provide satellite communication and exited. We invested in Linksab and exited. We invested in a company that was called ITN that was bought by Visaphone. That's our friend Jim's company. We've invested in a number of sort of businesses in that sector successfully. So I will say that it's a sector that actually, in some respects, demonstrates what is possible when the private sector is allowed to participate in a sector in the economy.
What has been your experience with manufacturing? Have you tried that sector?
We've done a bit, but not nearly as much as we should and would going forward. Okay. And the key to manufacturing, as you know, is that manufacturing interconnects with the rest of the economy. Let me just give you one interconnection. Think about power. The cost of doing business in manufacturing because of the power consumption tends to be high. Think about the relation between manufacturing and the cost here versus imported goods, and therefore policy around that. It means that if you're investing for the long term, you have to see some clarity that the businesses will be able to survive on their own without subsidy, because government can always form a view on subsidy. So we generally like businesses that are in sectors where, based on their own work, they can provide enough results to earn a return on the capital.
Excellent. Okay, so let's take a final time out. And I'll talk about apostles in the marketplace, which I know you and Capital Alliance are involved in, and then we'll talk about the future of private equity in Nigeria. We'll be right back.
My name is Nalaide Awoyemi. I dey live for Lagos. You see as our new Lagos just dey fine dey go. Good thing good o. To go market now, no hard at all. Just pay. Sit down inside BRT bus. Small time, you don't reach where they go. Hospital nko, e full ground. And for me and my pikin where I just born, treatment now free. You look left, you look right. Them they build new roads, new hospitals, new schools, new things everywhere. Everywhere they shine, gone. We thank God o. But come on, I hear saying that this tax money wey they pay, and then they use do all these good things. Me, I dey pay my own tax too. Say they pay on your own.
Pay your tax. It's your civic responsibility. It's your duty. It's the law.
You're welcome to my final segment with Dr. Okey Enalamah, CEO of African Capital Alliance. And we've had a very interesting, very exciting discussion around his life's journey and around the business of African Capital Alliance. So, okay, there's something you did which we don't know. I don't know how to situate it within the context of your life story, but I know you had a role, an important role in setting up the apostles in the marketplace. What was the objective of that?
Well, I like the way you put your question, because you said you've talked about life's journey, and you know, one of the things we've tried to do, both as African Capital Alliance and I would say for me as an individual as well, is how do you live out your life in full in a way that is non-fragmented and non-compartmentalized, right? So, if for instance I go to church on Sunday, I shouldn't go there and behave all holy, and then I come on Monday and say, well, this is a different ballgame. It doesn't make sense to do that to me.
Yeah.
And I think the Apostle in the Marketplace was an attempt, or is an attempt, because it's an ongoing attempt, to say, can we bring our values? You know, I mean, most people would tell you that Nigeria is probably one of the most churched and religious societies in the world, both in terms of Muslim faith and the Christian faith. And if you look at faith at its core, it's talking about values. You know, can we live out those values in everyday life, in the marketplace? So it was our own attempt to say, let people bring their faith in terms of their values to the marketplace. You know, importantly, integrity. Because the one thing we know, every faith that has survived preaches integrity. No faith that does not preach integrity will survive. And that is why, if you look at the great faiths that have survived, you know, or great religions that have survived, they all talk about integrity. And I'm not saying there isn't a gap between knowing and doing. So this is an attempt to bridge that gap. And we think in order to bridge that gap, people have to network with each other. It's actually called a network. Saying that, like, I network with you, and we say we're going to do things properly. You can hold me to account, I can hold you to account. We also think that we have to contribute to the betterment of society rather than just talk about the problems. I think we tend to criticize a lot, and I think criticism is fine, but frankly, is the lowest, is not the best use of our time. I think a better use of our time is to think solutions. This is our own attempt to say, if in one little corner, in your own space, you could implement those values you want to see, maybe in government, maybe in the wider society, it's a very good starting point. Let me illustrate this with a story. A few years ago, I was part of a fellowship organized by Aspen, the Aspen Institute in the US. You know, in this environment, it's called the Africa Leadership West Africa Initiative, you know, but it's an Aspen-affiliated initiative, fellowship. And at this fellowship, they were talking about how you create a good society. They were talking about societies from antiquity to the present day. And how do you create enlightened, effective leadership? You know, and I sat down and I was very humble, because this was when, as Capital Alliance, we were going through our own sort of issues in terms of just trying to build the kind of culture we wanted, what we call the ACA way, the kind of values we wanted. And I'm quite happy to share those values. But it wasn't like a gimme, right? We had to, in effect, live those values. And what I found humbling was that there I was talking about the bigger society and how to provide enlightened leadership to it. And I said, in my own little corner, have I actually done it? And I made a commitment to myself that when I go back, I will focus on African Capital Alliance, I'll focus on my family, to think in terms of those values. And these are values like contribution. What does it take for a person to want to be part of building a better society and stewardship, where you leave something better than you found it? Values like humility. What does it take to have self-awareness, to understand that, like, this same society we're condemning has done a lot. Why did I study medicine? Because it was, frankly, mostly free. I mean, if they had stamped the cost to it, maybe I would have had a rethink earlier than I did. But at the time I went to school, as you know, it was virtually free. In fact, you got paid for studying because you got all these bursaries and other things. And if you think about all that and you think about the society we now live in, you feel that you need to make a contribution, and it takes a certain humility. Integrity I talked about before. And then you can go on from there to excellence, and that's something we believe in as well as discipline. And all these things are interwoven. I think Apostle in the Marketplace is an attempt to live those values with other people who are similarly minded in a way that is productive, not to condemn other people, but to produce real value in the society. And we've sort of looked at education, we've looked at job creation, we've looked at governance and leadership and things like that to say, how can we be a force for good in society?
Excellent. So, okay, parting short, what do you see as the future of private equity in Nigeria? And before that, what are the challenges and constraints that you have faced in that?
One of the biggest constraints I see is the middle part of those three elements I talked about. I talked about access to the capital. I talked about access to the opportunities in terms of the businesses you're investing in. And I talked about the competence. And this competence and skills is not just to be a private equity manager and investor, but also in the businesses that you're investing in. Because if they don't have the right management, you find that you won't get the right returns. And I would say, capacity building and human resources and people is both the most critical resource and in some respects the constraint as well. Of course, there's the enabling environment. It could be better. I saw some of the earlier segments you've had on the macroeconomy and policy and stability and all those things. All those things help to anything that attracts investment helps private equity. And I would say private equity, going back to your question on prognosis and outlook, on balance, I would say it has a good outlook. But that's provided with one important caveat: you take a long-term view. And that's both our should I say house style, our approach as African Capital Alliance, and personally I believe in looking at things with from a long-term perspective, which means you can suffer some short-term problems or issues, and you roll with the punches, and you're more resilient than somebody who gets knocked out just because NEPA took light, because that's going to happen anyway. So I think the real point is that, if you take a long-term view, you find that private equity is interesting. Why do I say so? Go back to the three elements. Funding. The fact that the pension funds are accumulating at a pace where they need outlets, right, means that if you can do private equity well, it can help be part of the solution, because it can provide sustainable returns, superior returns over time to the pensioners and the beneficiaries of those pension funds. That's one. If you think about it in terms of Africa itself, there's a lot of interest in Africa. Some people say it's the last frontier, and private equity has a role to play in that. If you think about it in terms of foreign direct investment, you find that we are one of the better partners to foreign investment because we are local. We can somehow bring the local knowledge to foreign investors coming in, and that partnership like MTN or G4S. I mean, there's so many businesses with Protea Hotels. There are so many businesses in this market that you see that we've helped partner with to bring successfully into this market. And that's a model that I think is sustainable over the long term.
That's one sector we didn't talk about, the hospitality.
Yeah, and that sector is also doing well.
Done a big play in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that sector is also doing well. Now, if you think about it in terms of the opportunities, Nigeria is a land of opportunity. The challenge is timing. When will a sector be ready? Look at power. We've been talking power for over 10 years. But many people will agree that power is probably more ready now. So I think if you take a long-term view, that all these elements will come together to give private equity a good outlook. We clearly have to roll up our sleeves and do the work, because it's actually a very demanding area to do successfully.
Interesting. Well, okay, thank you very much for coming
Thank you
on the
for
Policy
having me.
Council.
Thank you.
We'll be right back.
My name is Femi Drojayi. Welcome to the New Lagos, where things are improving every day. I work on the island and live on the mainland. But that's no longer a problem. With improved roads, I get to work faster. Sometimes I even leave my car and use the BRT bus, which is comfortable, fast, efficient, and reliable. After a hard day's work, the nights and evenings are even more fun. The streets are better lit, and the city is more secure, so I can catch my phone in peace. I pay my taxes because I want to continue enjoying the good things a big modern city like our Lagos brings. So it's my taxes that makes them real. Have you paid your tax?
Pay your tax. It's your civic responsibility. It's your duty. It's the law.
Those were very interesting conversations with Okey and Enalamah. And I'm sure that we all benefited in some way from watching these editions. There are many interesting takeaways. One, Okey's story tells us you can do whatever you want to do, and there's never too late to start. I'm sure there are many Nigerians who thought, hey, I've already qualified as a doctor. I can no longer be an accountant. My life tells the same story. As you know, I read law, but most people believe I'm an economist. But beyond that, the role of private equity in national development, in economic development, as well as many other elements of the financing system, have been very well highlighted in these editions. And finally, we focused on values. Without changing national values for the better, well, we would sub-optimize in all things. In the end, it's about values, and faith has a role to play in shaping those values. Thank you very much for watching. See you next time.